There are a lot of literary terms that we'll be talking about with the Odyssey, so in part one of this video we'll just cover half of them. And a few of these will be repeats, but epic poem is not a repeat. This is one that we haven't talked about yet. An epic poem is a long narrative poem, which should tell you, narrative, remember, means story, so it tells a story. And the poem contains a hero and often a fantastic creature such as a monster or some other worthy adversary for the hero to fight. So some famous examples of epic poems would be like the Iliad, the Odyssey, and Beowulf. Usually epic poems are famous enough that there are movies made about them. So there are movies about all three of these, and kids across America would read any or all of these in school. This year we're just studying the Iliad and the Odyssey. So whenever you think about the word epic, remember epic means something that's a big deal or something that's huge. Like an epic fail is a horrible or a huge fail. So epic poem is just a really big, really fancy, really famous poem. Okay, an epic hero is someone who is larger than life. It's a figure from history or legend who is valued by a certain culture. So each culture would have stories with their own heroes that have traits pertinent to their own cultural values. So for Greek mythology, some of the traits that the epic heroes possess would be strength, bravery, and intellect. And these pictures are actually from the epic poem Beowulf, which if you take enriched English your senior year, you'll read that. Okay, epithet. This one we talked about with Romeo and Juliet. It's an adjective or descriptive phrase expressing a quality regarded as characteristic of the person or thing mentioned. So, some examples here, like the city of Chicago. You could refer to it as the Windy City, and everyone who's familiar with that phrase or that epithet knows you're talking about Chicago. From the Iliad, one of the epithets that Homer uses to describe him is tamer of horses. So if you're just to say the tamer of horses, people who are familiar with the Iliad would know you're talking about Hector, the eldest Trojan prince. Then you have vampire hunter for the fictional Abraham Lincoln, and Sultan of Swat and the Great Bambino for Babe Ruth. And a more modern example would be the Girl on Fire. Hopefully everybody is familiar with the Hunger Games and Katniss Everdeen. Okay, so epic similes. Hopefully we all remember what a simile is at this point, but an epic simile is just a grand simile that extends on over several lines of a poem. And so it's elaborate, it's long, it's comparison of unlike objects using like or as, or sometimes in an epic poem, the word so is used for an epic simile. Okay, so here's an example from the Iliad. As, there's our comparison word, as is the generation of leaves, so is that of humanity. The wind scatters the leaves on the ground, but the live timber multiplies with leaves again in the spring, in the season of spring returning. So one generation of men will grow, while another dies. So again, we have that word so, the comparison word. So talking about the leaves falling off the trees, and with humanity, people die, but still in the spring, new leaves are flourishing on the trees, and in the same way, even though people die, there are new babies and new generations being born. Okay, so situational irony is, there are three types of irony, remember. Dramatic irony we talked about with Romeo and Juliet, where the audience knows information the characters in the story don't know. Situational irony is when something happens that is the opposite or contrary to what you expect to happen in a given situation. So in the story of the Trojan War, the Iliad, Troy's walls are just like impenetrable. It's a fortress. Nobody can get inside those walls. No enemies have ever been inside. However, Odysseus comes up with this wily idea of the Trojan horse, and then the Trojans bring the enemy inside the walls themselves via the Trojan horse. So it's kind of ironic in a situational way that enemies for many, many years could not get inside those Trojan walls, and then the Trojans themselves are the ones who bring the enemy inside. Okay, verbal irony is the third type of irony. This is when a person says one thing and means another. They're usually trying to be funny or dramatic or sarcastic. So here's an example. After I told Lisa I had to spend the weekend cleaning my garage, she smiled at me and said, "Ha, lucky you." And so we've all had conversations like this with our friends before, where we say one thing and our friend knows that clearly we did not mean that thing. We probably meant the opposite of what we just said. Okay, then we have symbolism. Symbolism is any object that stands for or represents something else. So in the story The Iliad, a big symbol is the color black. Achilles' black sail and armor represent his commitment to killing and his lack of loyalty to any given army. It could also symbolize his hatred of or defiance of Agamemnon. So in many stories, colors are symbolic, as are other objects, like hearts are symbolic of love. Okay, allusions. One of the huge reasons that we study Greek mythology is because we in our modern day have so many allusions to these famous Greek characters and stories. So allusions are references to a well-known person, place, event, literary work, or work of art. If you remember from Romeo and Juliet, Shakespeare himself made a ton of references to Greek mythology, because even though Shakespeare lived 600 years ago, Greek mythology was created thousands of years ago. So we see Greek allusions every day, we just don't realize it. So that's one of the things that we try to do, is to make you aware of all of these allusions and where words and phrases and symbols come from. Okay, euphemism. I like this one. It's the substitution of a potentially offensive phrase with a more appropriate one. So a lot of times teachers use euphemisms to talk about homework or a test. You know, if your teacher says, "Oh, you're going to have a little quizzle or a little Quizlet tomorrow," that could be a euphemism for a quiz, which has a more negative connotation. If they were to say, "Oh, we have this fun activity we're going to do today in class," that might be a euphemism for some kind of worksheet. You can have euphemisms for homework. There are all sorts of educational euphemisms. So some other examples: to pass away is a more kind way of saying to die. To powder your nose is a ladylike way of saying that you're going to go use the restroom. Canoodling, I don't know if you're familiar with that one or not, but sometimes when people get written up for PDA in the hallway, they're doing some form of canoodling. If you're between jobs, it means usually that you were fired. And if you say, "Oh, you're just big boned," supposedly that's a euphemism for being fat, although I would probably be insulted if I was called big boned too. So what euphemism is used in the movie Scarface in reference to the gun? I don't know if you've seen this movie before, but they call it My Little Friend, right? And then the White Sox announcer, quite a few years ago, every time somebody got a home run, he would say hello to my little friend, which is an allusion to the movie. So that would be a euphemism too. Okay, denotation. Think denotation starts with a D, dictionary starts with a D, definition starts with a D. So the dictionary meaning of a word, independent of other associations that the word might have. So an example, there is a denotation, a definition for the word cougar, a large feline native to the mountainous regions. And there are also other associations that we have with that word cougar, which brings us to connotation. So connotation is a set of ideas associated with the term in addition to its dictionary definition. So some of you might be familiar with the connotation for the word cougar, which could be an older woman who goes for a younger man. So when we use words, and we talk about this in our writing too, when we use words, we need to pick words that have appropriate connotations so that readers are making the connections and associations that we want them to. Similarly, poets and authors of the stories we read have to pick words that have appropriate denotations and connotations. Okay, foreshadowing. This should be old news. When the author provides clues about something that will happen later in the story. So an example would be in one of the versions of the Trojan War myths. The Trojan soothsayer warns King Priam not to bring the Trojan horse inside the city walls. He says, "Beware gifts from the Greeks." And then everything after that is history. We know that, well, fictional history anyway. We know that the Trojans do indeed bring the Greek horse inside the city walls, which leads to the destruction of their city. Okay, and the last one for this segment is a flashback. A flashback is a narrative technique that allows a writer to present past events during current events in order. By giving material that occurred prior to the present event, the writer provides the reader with insight into a character's motivation and/or background to a conflict. So if you think back to the short story, The Scarlet Ibis, that we read, and the very beginning of the story, it's present time, and Brother is reflecting on his relationship with his younger brother Doodle, and then he flashes back to tell us about everything that happened from the time Doodle was born to the time that he sadly passed away. Euphemism. Okay, so that wraps up today's terms, and don't forget to tune back in for part 2 of the literary terms video for the Odyssey.